Good evening. I'm Karen Taylor, and I am Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen. And I'm so pleased to welcome you all here this evening. This lecture is part of the Labour, Literature and Landmark lecture series, and it is our third and final landmark lecture of the fall season. We are so pleased to present this series of landmark lectures in partnership with the New York Landmarks Conservancy, and I would like to express our appreciation to them for their help and support throughout the series. I would also like to express our thanks to Archtober, a month-long celebration of New York City architecture and design during October, for their promotional assistance. For those of you who may be less familiar with the General Society, I hope you don't mind if I give a quick overview. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York was founded in 1785. Today, our 235-year-old organization continues to serve and support the people of the City of New York through our educational and cultural programs. These include our library, which is going to be celebrating its 200th anniversary in November, our John M. Mossman Locke Museum, our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, and finally, our lecture series, of which, of course, tonight is part of. And it also has a long and distinguished history because it was started in 1837. Now, during the lecture, there will be an opportunity to submit typewritten questions through the Q&A section. And at the end of the talk, we will answer as many of those questions as we can in our Q&A section. I also want to mention that our speaker tonight, Patrick Ciccone, is the co-author of this absolutely magnificent book. Now, I don't know, maybe it's not showing up very well on this screen. It's reversed for me, but anyway, I just have to tell you, it's just like the most amazing book and warmly recommended. And it's been sold by Rizzoli Bookstore. To introduce our speaker this evening, I'm very pleased to introduce the curator for the series, Lisa Easton, who is a partner in Easton Architects, a New York City-based architecture and historic preservation firm. Lisa, over to you.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. Patrick, thank you for sharing your brilliance with us this evening. I'm very happy to present this fourth lecture in our series for this year. And I'd like to start by just a brief introduction to what preservation really means. In preservation, it provides us with tangible objects that provide identity, memory, and continuity to ourselves, our communities, and our own personal history. It helps root us in our heritage and develop a unity and provide a spirit that helps define neighborhoods, communities, and cities. It establishes a timeline, and it provides answers to the question of time and place, rise and fall, riches and neglect. Preservation is not about being nostalgic. It is about living in a better present, that we are part of a broader reach that connects eras, creates continuity, and embraces a more cumulative whole. And that is as important as the physical landmarks that represent our past and provide the foundation for our future. I am honored to be a part of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen 2020 Labor, Literature, and Landmark Lecture Series. And when asked to curate the four-part Landmarks Lecture Series, I wanted to bring together a group of individuals whose experience captures the essence of preserving our treasured landmarks, from technology of materials and methodology to advocacy and historic research. Tonight, I am honored to introduce our fourth lecturer in this year's series, Patrick Ciccone. Patrick is a graduate of the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Historic Preservation at Columbia University, where he also studied comparative literature as an undergraduate. He is currently vice president at Crow Hill Development, a real estate development firm based here in New York City, and has led major historic rehabilitation projects in Brooklyn, upstate New York, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And he is a trustee on the board of the Preservation League of New York. I'm honored, and it is my great pleasure to present to you this evening, Patrick Ciccone.
Thanks, everyone, and a sincere thanks to everyone at the General Society, Lisa, Karen, Victoria, Angelo, and the Landmarks Conservancy. It's very difficult for me to not be able to see the audience and do it because I love performing and presenting live in front. So this is a great substitute since we can't all be together. Before I launch in with the slides, just an outline of how the talk is going to be divided. I'm going to try to talk for about 35 minutes, and then we'll have time for a little bit more of Q&A, because I think this is a subject that people know a lot about and have questions. And then the talk, to give you an outline of where I'm going with this, I'm going to present sort of a brief history of row houses in general, then go into their subsequent decline, and then a brief history of actually how the original book written by Charles Lockwood came to be, and then finally end up with how this edition, how I ended up working on this classic and having a new edition come out, and how we ended up there, and then we'll go to questions. So with that, I'm going to share the screen and we'll begin. New York is a city of houses. This may not be obvious in a city now more famous for its skyscrapers and apartment buildings, not to mention its loft buildings and tenements. However, it is the row house, or brownstone, as it is more popularly known, that remains the essential building block for understanding New York's form, even though many sections of the city, especially in Manhattan, have since been rebuilt, often many times over. These houses remain the markers of New York's urbanity and scale, against which newer buildings must be measured. Though it was the street grid that created the armature of the city's future shape, it was house rows that fleshed out that form into buildings. Built into successive waves of real estate development from the early 1800s onward, row houses were the first structures to be constructed after outlying farmland was divided into building lots. Row houses in Manhattan were built from the Battery north along Broadway to Bond Street and Washington Square in Greenwich Village. And then were constructed in great numbers up the spine of the island on 5th and Madison Avenue and side streets, then to the east and west sides and uptown across Harlem. In Brooklyn, which you see on the screen, I'll discuss in a second, tens of thousands of row houses were built from Brooklyn Heights south to today's Cobble Hill and Carroll Gardens, and east to Fort Greene and Clinton Hill and to Park Slope, then out to Bedford-Stuyvesant and Crown Heights and Eastern Parkway, and along the spokes of the trolley lines, miles from the Brooklyn Bridge, deep into the present borough. So what you have in front of you is Maple Street and Prospect Lefferts Gardens. And I want to actually walk you back in time, not along the same street, but in a similar development, walking backward from the streetscape of the present, photograph for the book, with the street trees and house rows. First, back in time, this is West 46th Street around 1900, showing the monumental streetscape of all these houses together after they had been built up into a row, receding into an almost comical single point perspective of sameness, and really not mitigated by the softness of any of street trees. And then back further in time, this again, we're jumping around geographically, but want you to see the connection between all these neighborhoods. Now we're at 49, 51, 53. It's actually 53 is on the left, 133rd Street between 5th and Lenox Avenue in Harlem. This is a view of the houses in groups of 3, and then a few more larger group in the back before they've coalesced into a streetscape of row houses that is familiar to us today in every row house neighborhood. And then jumping back even further in time, but we're going to go aerial, so a slight change in perspective. These are row houses under construction on West 72nd Street from the roof, actually viewed from the roof of the Dakota. Both buildings, both the Dakota, of course, the Dakota was of course designed by Henry Hardenberg, but these were as well. So these houses on West 72nd Street, you can see them completed, but you can also see them in their most basic form, which is not actually from the styles that we see today, but as developments of the street grid itself. So this is a little more obvious once we go to the street grid. Built as single-family residences, row houses became an increasingly geographically inefficient way to allocate housing demand in a city where as early as the 1830s, stratospheric land prices made it impossible for the market to provide comfortable residences for the working middle class. quote, New York is fast becoming a city of the very rich and the very poor. The American Architect and Building Owners wrote in 1878. That's a lament that will sound familiar to New Yorkers of almost any era. According to the magazine, the row house itself was to blame, as the city's 25 100 by 100 foot building lots, and this obviously we can't resolve to that perspective, and they're not actually on here, but the grid plan divided it into these building lots. These building lots encourage the construction either of houses, row houses were built for single families, quote, in which only the rich can afford to live, or on the same size parcel, a tenement that housed many families at once, often in substandard conditions. So before we jump into the houses themselves, remember that it was actually the latter where the majority of the city's population lived, either in tenements or in converted houses that had been converted from the single family, even though the single family house took up a large geographic area of the city. So I want to answer 4 basic questions about the row house. First, what was a row house? That may seem simple. Second, who designed them? Third, where do they survive? And then 4, why did they stop being built? So the first, what is the row house? That might seem a basic question, but it's useful to lay out what an individual house contains. On your screen, you see 37 and 39 Charlton Street, which are in the Charlton Van Dam Historic District. These are federal style houses constructed in the early 1820s. And even though Bricks and Brownstone, as it was originally written and has been revised, is in part a history of styles, I want you to actually think what lies behind all these facades and why the houses are organized in this way. So connect visually back to those boxes that we saw on West 72nd Street. This is the exploitation of a building lot, usually actually narrower than the 25 by 100 foot building lot, into means to house a single family in modest to great comfort. And there's actually not that many ways to organize this space inside when you're really open to the street only on one side. So I'm going to take you to a plan into a second, and all of you listening know this, but it's nice to revisit the obvious. It's here in the high stoop configuration is that the service entrance is below street level, below the stoop, and that the main floors of the house, the parlor floor, were reached going up these steps through the entryway, with the bedrooms and other areas on the top floors. So we can see this more explicitly in the floor plan for the same house. Now, this actually is not the original floor plan. This is a Historic American Building Survey drawing of the same houses that was done in the 1930s, where bathrooms have been added, since a house at this date wouldn't have had bathrooms. But I like these drawings to give you this very basic cross-section and idea of what's in the row house and how ultimately stable it is. I'm not going to show you any other floor plans, but even as these houses grow bigger through the 19th century, there's, for the large part, there's a fairly basic floor plan that is used over and over again. The only modification that we'll see, and we won't really have time to discuss it today, is actually in where the entrance is. So on here, and hopefully you guys can see it in resolutions, in sufficient resolution, is the generic floor plan. On the left, you have that basement floor, again, access through the stoop with a hallway on the bottom right and a dining room facing the front with the kitchen in the rear. And then on the parlor floor, the grandest floor of the house is shown as first floor here. There you go up the stoop into a stair hallway. Here, the stairs at the back, it might be in the middle a little bit later. And then you have the front and rear parlors. Then above it, you have the bedrooms. On the second floor, the original closets have been replaced by the bathroom. And then on the top floors, you have these servants, the bedrooms, which would have been used, at least some of them, for servants in this house. This floor plan is the fairly generic template for all houses constructed in Manhattan and Brooklyn going into the future. They make it longer, add parlors, and again, at the end of the 19th century, they will vary significantly in placement of the stairs and the entranceways. But remember, again, pointing back to the street, those houses under construction in the street grid, that the row house, apart from its style, is fundamentally a way to develop building lots, relatively small building lots, into single family houses. So that answers our first question, or touches on it. The second question I wanted to discuss is who built these houses? Throughout the 19th century, architects rarely designed New York houses. At that time, the professional architect hired by a client to design a house, handle all legal details, supervise construction, really didn't exist in the United States. Most builders purchased standard row house front and interior plans from amateur architects or ordinary draftsmen, or used builders' guides and patterns book. The proliferation of row houses reflected the transformative forces shaping New York's 19th century economy. Though today an intact brownstone might strike us as the creation of a lost era of individual design and artisanship, nearly all of our cherished historic row house buildings and neighborhoods were built on speculation by developers for profit. And what you have on the screen here is a sort of a candid reminder of how art and commerce mix. This is a wonderful collection at the New York Historical Society of an architect builder, G.W. Martins, who was active in Brooklyn in the 1850s and a little bit before and after. So he was, as far as the historical record appears, was both the architect and was involved in the financing and building of his houses. Other money may have been involved, but in this folder of plans, there are intact plans, but there are a lot that have actually been divided, cut up for molding profiles and other things in the houses. It would be lovely to be able to bring these out of the New York Historical Society and put them in an intact house if that exists. But it's sort of a wonderful reminder that the roles that we see today of separate architect, contractor, developer didn't really exist, at least in the early 19th century. But again, the greater point, going back to that grid plan and those houses and thinking of them almost as predecessors to today's Excel spreadsheets, is that these houses were built, however beautiful they are, for profit. Third question, where were row houses built and where do they survive? What you see here is a view looking south from Union Square, taken from published in 1857, looking south. The most basic summary to remember of where houses existed in the city when they were built and where they exist today is that 19th century Manhattan filled up almost like a glass being filled from south to north, from the Battery northward. Those neighborhoods I recounted at the beginning of the talk, those were succeeding fashionable neighborhoods that got replaced relatively rapidly, especially much more rapidly than we would imagine today. So at one time it was possible, as it was here, to look south and see a city that was mostly row houses, and in the spine centered largely, and in the center of the Manhattan Island, still largely row houses. But in Manhattan, this constant uptown movement and replacement of houses meant that these houses gradually, in a short span of time, became rooming houses, were converted to commerce, and were ultimately, many of them, or most of them, torn down in favor of taller buildings that we know today, and many of which are designated historic districts on their own. Now, this movement is actually, it's Charles II book, Manhattan Moves Uptown, covers this theme pretty extensively and is worth finding in addition to bricks and brownstone. But this is actually a photograph from 1866 of 14 Carroll Place, which is between today's it's Bleecker Street today, between Thompson and LaGuardia Place. This photograph, it's not dissimilar to the Merchant's House, but as far as could tell from the historical record, this was actually taken right before this wealthy Wall Street financier left this house and moved uptown, probably to Murray Hill or even farther uptown for a more fashionable neighborhood. With that said, where row houses do survive in number and relatively intact is in all of the brownstone belts, the so-called brownstone belts of Brooklyn. We'll go back to that in some of the images in the book and what we addressed, but just remember that New York's 19th century row house cityscape really survives intact only in Brooklyn, and then in some cases in uptown in neighborhoods like Harlem. And it's much more fragmented anywhere, including Upper East and West Side, or even the Village, where there obviously are a lot of row house survivors. So, fourth question, why did the row house stop being built? Again, we're just returning to this fundamental economic question of economics. It simply wasn't economically feasible for these small plots of land to be developed anymore. So around 1900, the apartment, even after being suggested for decades as a better way to develop urban land, won out over the row house, in part because, or really more than in part, because speculators in Manhattan could no longer make easy profits on houses. Real estate reality enforced a shift in societal mores, because previously people had been hesitant to have a building housing more than one family, at least for the upper class. So in 1903, architectural critic Herbert Crowley observed that the high-stoop brownstone dwelling had become, quote, extremely unfashionable, both in design and plan. This isn't a universal thing. In Brooklyn, where land remained less expensive, brownstone dwellings in updated styles continued to be constructed. But by World War I, the row house building tradition in New York was largely over. And even though houses continued to be built, which is part of what we can get to in the Q&A, this tradition, which had stretched from the Revolution, was largely dead by 1917. The slide that you see is a house on the Upper East Side that a brownstone mansion from the 1870s is actually being subsumed by the neo-Georgian houses around it, where architects have actually designed and rebuilt fashionable townhouses at the turn of the 20th century. So townhouses continue to be designed and built by the rich in this era, but the era of this speculatively developed row house in Manhattan, at least, was all but over by the early 20th century. So we're moving on to the second about sort of this afterlife of the row house. The survival of so many brownstones today is perhaps surprising, given the low esteem in which they were held in the early decades of the 20th century, when New York transformed skyward with elevator apartment buildings and towering skyscrapers. Many of these new structures replaced earlier row houses, Metropolis subsuming Washington Square, and aging brownstones were regarded as bygone relics, sometimes not even worthy of nostalgia. Now, when they were worthy of nostalgia, we have this New York Times article from 1926, which is a pretty wonderful travel log through the city at the time. And to quote from it, the article says, quote, "Long blocks of these stolidly respectable houses are yielding to the record. Before long, the saunter who looks for the remains of old New York will have to look twice to find a brownstone front. In almost every cross street of central Manhattan, from river to river, the dignity of brownstone gives way to shining new structures that rise higher." And then dramatically in the late 30s, you can see in large numbers the houses, at least in Manhattan, being demolished. This is a picture in 1939 in Midtown, where the entire parlor floor remains intact, but everything has been scooped away behind it. And the sentiment of this era was not charitable toward this form of housing. In 1943, Cleveland Rogers, a city planner in New York Plans for the Future, wrote about brownstone, or about row houses or brownstones, quote, "Standing in solid rows, using every foot of frontage, even the best brownstone house districts today are potential slums. Tenements were at least designed for multiple family use. Brownstone houses were not." And then, of course, the ultimate disdain, Edith Wharton writing in The Age of Innocence, that brownstone was the uniform hue that coated New York like a cold chocolate sauce. So around World War II, there was not a large amount of appreciation for this form of housing. And another Edith Wharton quote, in a backward glance, she actually described the houses of Fifth Avenue of the era, the same ones we saw being demolished, as desperate in their uniformity of style. But at the same time, a revival, or at least a revival of interest, was underway. Some of it had actually started at the time that row houses were still being speculatively constructed. In 1899, the critic Montgomery Schuyler wrote a house called The Small City House in New York, where he actually wrote the first history and appreciation of the very earliest federal houses. The ones on Charlton Street, pictured here, I think were demolished in the early 20th century. But this is sort of the first appreciation, where he writes that it owed its, he said the houses were more than decent. They were elegant, sort of an appreciation of this, what at the time was almost viewed as a prehistorical era of New York City architecture. but there really wasn't that much study of the row house as a form. The first serious study was a master's thesis handwritten here about the New York house between 1800 and 1850. And then even into the 1960s, when the preservation movement was picking up steam, there was no comprehensive catalog of this. New York, classic New York, Ada Louise Huxtable's history of the Federal and Greek Revival era and walking tour is sort of the closest that comes to documenting all these buildings. And this book was definitely the direct inspiration, one of the direct inspirations for Brooks and Brownstone at the time. And I'd like to read you something from it, because as usual, Ada Louise Huxtable says things about New York City architecture that are much more eloquent than anyone else can reach. So she's talking about preservation in general, but I think this also is a special insight of preservation about the row house, which, as you saw at the beginning, is really more than forms more than the sum of its parts by forming these streetscapes. So quoting her from the introduction, those accidental and anonymous survivors of the city's early years may be gone before this guide ever reaches the reader's hands. Some can and should be saved. Some are monuments beyond saving. All are a special problem in preservation, for they are not monuments or masterpieces, but a more modest part of the city's original fabric. They rank as street architecture rather than landmarks. Built as part of the street, they continue to live as part of it, even in incongruous transformation. In isolation, they lose their meaning. I think that you can say the same thing about row houses as they coalesce from individual houses into these cityscapes. The destructive forces of post-war urban renewal in New York, with the government harnessing the power to obliterate generations of the history of the wrecking ball, were the catalyst of the massive shift in the attitudes of the city's architectural heritage. Robert Moses's plan for an expressway through Brooklyn Heights, a collection of row house architecture unmatched by its beauty and integrity, sections of which had continuously been home to Brooklyn's gentry since the 1820s, spurred protests by those with political power and will to fight. Brooklyn Heights was the first historic district designated after the creation of New York Landmarks Preservation Commission in 1965, and was followed by over the next decade by landmark designation of many other major row house districts, historic districts, small and large. But designation alone did not assure continued vitality. Many brownstone districts have been redlined as part of racist housing policies, making it impossible to purchase or finance work on row housing through banks. Bedford-Stuyvesant, the city's largest and most spectacular collection of late 19th century row houses, survives due to the fortitude and perseverance of Black homeowners denied such traditional means of financing. However, sort of more famously, and what the slide shows, and really the immediate backdrop to the book, were the self-dubbed Brownstoners, who in the 50s and coalescing into a movement in the 60s, began renovating old row houses in a form of counterculture, rejection of the perceived sterility of post-war American consumerism in suburbia. By 1969, the slide you see on the screen, New York Magazine declared a brownstone fever, and the city's master plan that year also celebrated these mostly white, mostly affluent the Brownstoner movement, who, quote, in the face of considerable odds and dire predictions, were expending great amounts of energy on restoring what were still considered obsolete houses in rundown areas of the city. So that's bringing us into the third part of this, the immediate origin of Brooks and Brownstone against this backdrop. And I won't go that much into it and leave it for the Q&A. But Charles Lockwood was an undergraduate at Princeton in the late 60s and actually spent much time staying with Brownstoners, including the Ortners in Park Slope, spending time in row houses and sort of absorbing this history. But there was no book about it. Actually, in the previous introduction of the book, Charles recounts going into the Delano Library in Midtown, asking, where could I find a book on New York brownstones? I asked at the reference desk. We don't have one, the librarian said. It's never been written. Are you sure? I asked, somewhat surprised. I'm sure. So Brooks and Brownstone began actually as Charles's senior thesis at Princeton, and then was developed into a book. Famously, and this was a moment that tied both the book, Charles, the house, and 1960s and 1970s New York history together. Charles and the original photographer, Robert Meyer, were standing on West 11th Street on March 6, 1970, photographing Greek Revival doorways when 18 West 11th exploded. The Weather Underground were planning to bomb Columbia University, but the bomb factory and the bombs were ill-conceived. So the entire house was detonated. Their photograph, as they are the closest to the site, was published the next day on the front page of the New York Times. This was sort of the Big Bang origin story of the book as well, of being born through this crucible of people's interest in brownstones and very little literal destruction of historic fabric in a dramatic way. So the first edition of the book came out in 1972, which you have at the upper left. Keep in mind that Charles was very young, but for such a comprehensive and scholarly book, he was 24 when this was published. So you can see, and as you probably know or have these in your collection, various editions published over the years. The 1972 edition was reprinted in the 80s by Abbeville, actually as sort of a restoration manual, and then Rizzoli in 2003 brought out the editions with color photography, new color photography in plates, though the substantial part of the text wasn't revised. So to use the old phrase of moviegoing, this is where I came in. I started working with Charles in grad school in 2006 when he needed a research assistant on journalism, sort of unrelated to bricks and brownstone and architectural history. But he wanted to revisit this book and to at least substantially add and change parts of it that had been left untouched for a while. Again, going back to his age, this book was very much tied up in his identity and who he was. So it was definitely something that he considered as part of himself. So if you know the original book at all, it's divided into stylistic history of the Federal style, the Greek Revival, and then a large chapter on the Gothic Revival, even though there aren't very many row houses in that style. A very large section on the Italianate and mostly on the Italianate style. And then a very sort of rushed treatment of everything afterwards was partially because he ran out of writing time and of money. But as you know, there's actually many more surviving row houses built after the Civil War than from before. And all of these houses that survive in Brooklyn today, most of them date, or the vast majority of them date from this era. And even though this book has been viewed as the row house Bible, the Brownstone Bible, there really wasn't a comprehensive treatment of that. So the idea of expanding it was bounced around between us for a while. And I worked with Charles on a couple other book projects behind the scenes. In 2012, however, Charles died of cancer, but he and his estate gave me the incredibly humiliating, I want to say, mantle of being in charge of revising the book and putting it out for the future with relatively carte blanche of what to do. So I sort of want to walk you through what's in the new version of the book. Hopefully you either have the new version of the book or will be getting it and know the old version of the book and the process, and then we'll leave you after that open for discussion. As I said, that the biggest thing was documenting these later styles and buildings that weren't included in detail in the book. So this includes Romanesque, Renaissance Revival, Queen Anne, all these relatively eclectic styles from the 1870s and 1880s, and then with Beaux-Arts and neoclassical styles in the subsequent decades. So started scouting photography first, and then ended up connecting with the extremely talented photographer of the book, Dylan Chandler. I would scout everything in advance, and then Dylan would shoot. So systematically covered most historic row house neighborhoods in the city. And then as we collected these materials, on the left, you see details of a house in Bedford-Stuyvesant on Hancock Street. On the right, railways in Prospect Heights. And then here's a Queen Anne house in Park Slope on Union Street on the left. Renaissance Revival houses, this limestone above, brownstone below scheme on Jumel Terrace. As we started gathering these, we realized it was going to be hard to splice this in the original book, as sort of the original publishing mandate had contract foresaw and Charles foresaw. So at that point decided that needed to revisit the entire and rework the entire book, both in visuals and in text. So went back systematically, and here's one of my favorite photos in the book on Mount Morris Park West, and then also Neo-Georgian houses, Neo-Federal style houses really, in Flatbush on the right. So we went back and started photographing stuff that had appeared in the book or was similar to what had appeared that wasn't available, going through these stylistic eras. So just to run through some of the riches of the imagery in the book, we have Federal style houses on the left, the 131 Charles Street, a mantle on Charlton Street, the house we saw earlier. The Greek Revival, the grand row of houses on Washington Square North, to the plasterwork at the Merchant's House on the right. Then again to the sort of familiar brownstone, the one on the left in Brooklyn Heights on sort of a grand version of that. And then the beautiful yet more generic row of houses on South Portland Place in Fort Greene. And as we did this, what we also wanted to do in the book was show interiors in a way that was refreshing, that made people want to not destroy historic house interiors. It's all too common today for these houses to actually be entirely obliterated. Again, going back to that image of the boxes on West 72nd Street, for these to be simply carte blanche for wealthy homeowners to destroy everything. So wanted to show that it was possible to live in these homes in a somewhat modern fashion, but to respect them, but also to make the interior seem inviting. I think that the problem with earlier editions of the book is that the interiors didn't quite capture what was wonderful about some of the spaces. So this is entering into a house, an Italianate house on Park Place in Prospect Heights, where we almost have this wonderful labyrinth of doors entering into the parlor stairway hallway and then into the parlor. And these ones of showing a relatively, I put modern in quotes, of light painted walls, but all the details intact. Nothing we would consider living in any sort of period fashion, which I think sort of ended up being applied to some of the Brownstoner movement incorrectly. And then these ones with original details, but white walls, but then showing the other direction. This is I hesitate to use the word Victorian, but a Victorian fantasy of a house in Bed-Stuy. And then on the right, Otis Pratt and Nancy Pearsall's house on Willow Street in Brooklyn Heights, which is very much as the house would have been when it was originally inhabited from the 1820s. So, and then going back here, of course, to the row on Washington Square. The row house, at least in its original single-family form, was never home to more than a fraction of the city's population. Nevertheless, the row house epitomized the city's potential urbanity and grace. New York's row houses have for over 2 centuries, in fact, proven suitable to many future lives. Rather than enforcing uniformity, the complaint long levied at brownstones, row houses tend instead to create a dense but not overwhelming streetscape. And one, through the many entrances and size of the buildings themselves, promotes a lively variety in human scale that no other form of New York building has arguably since matched. This urbanism is also wonderful simply for its splendor. New York's row houses display some of the city's most glorious vernacular architecture, from the classicism of the Federal style to the austere Greek Revival, the showy Italianate, the eclecticism of Queen Anne and Romanesque Revival, the academic Beaux-Arts, to name just a few. Together, where they survive, these houses form what is part gallery, part library, part stage set, but also more than all those things combined, since beauty, history, and scenography together create the cityscape in which we live our daily lives. Today, as New York continues to be rebuilt in even taller and more crystalline form, the skyline and streets of boom areas suffer from a placelessness, which has perhaps less to do with the architectural quality of the buildings themselves, but from their disconnect from the city from which they spring. New York, of course, has been and will always be ever-changing and dynamic. But this historic cityscape must continue to undergird the spiritual as well as the real city. And then returning to Ada Louise Huxtable, she wrote in Classic New York, quote, A city in its most real sense is its buildings, the structures that its inhabitants have erected for their use and pride, even the buildings that have come and gone, and the way in which those buildings are disposed upon the streets and squares of art. Sorry, the way, she's so eloquent in writing that it's hard to read it. Let me start the quote again. A city in its most real sense is its buildings, the structures and its inhabitants have erected for its use and pride, even the buildings that have come and gone, and the way in which those buildings are disposed upon the streets and squares are the source of its personality, its style, and its distinguishing stamp, end quote. The brownstone remains, and hopefully will remain for centuries to come, the architectural foundation of New York's collective sense of identity and place. So with that, I want to thank everyone and open it up for questions.
Patrick, I'm going to thank you at length later on, but in the immediate time, I just want to thank you so much. That was just absolutely fascinating. And we do have a few questions, and I'm sure we're going to have more. So I'm going to read out the first one, and this is from Michelle Guteretz. Was the series by Ada Louise Huxtable ever completed? I have the first book, but cannot seem to chase down the other three.
I don't think it was ever finished. I wish it was. I think that's the only one, because I think that I don't have it handy. Is that she actually does describe what the other books' names are, but I don't think it was ever finished. This is actually this is the audience that will appreciate this joke, is that it's sort of like asking how many books are in the Pearson and Geordie American Buildings and Architects series, since I think it's like the second book has two parts, but then there's like not a third, but then there's a fourth. But there's definitely, I think that's the only one, unfortunately.
Right. Next question. We have from Kenneth Sisk. Where were the masonry artisans from? Which countries did most of them come from?
You know, I think I don't know in detail there. I think that it's largely, following immigration, at least in the beginning, is that it's people from the British Isles. Where exactly, I don't know. A lot of the building trades, at least up through the turn of the 20th century, seem to still be remaining in Anglo-Irish hands. But I'm not don't have definitive knowledge of the origin of the laborers of the construction trades.
Right, the next question, and this is quite a long question. This is from Hannah Wiggers. Forgive me, Hannah, if I mispronounced your last name. What do you think are some of the main topics of study within the history of brownstone and townhouses that have not been explored and do not feature in your book? Hannah is an architectural historian and happens to live in a brownstone in Fort Greene, but in a building that's been divided into multiple departments. I think that's a chapter of these structures' history that could be explored. But are there other topics that come to mind for you?
I think that that's the biggest one, is that I think that the thing that I didn't say in the presentation is that one of the scary things about taking on this book is that the breadth of it's so wide, is that you have to leave so much on the cutting room floor. But basically almost everything about the later adaptation of these houses has been left out. So as you said, that this is something that Andrew Dolkirk's book covers modifications of houses into townhouse in the early 20th century. But beyond that, there isn't not a book, or really even, I think, serious research figuring out how these things were divided later. Though I think that the book that maybe hasn't been written, there is one title from the 90s, but it's sort of a comparative history of this form, is that, this is not something that's endemic just to New York, but New York's form, at least in the US, is more extreme because of the wealth of New York City. So if you go up and down the Eastern Seaboard, Baltimore and Philadelphia are also row house cities. Philadelphia even maybe more so, but because of the economics, the economy of those cities, actually the houses were built for a far broader segment of the population. And obviously a comparison between New York, London, Boston, early townhouses all that I think would be fruitful, since it is not just New York in isolation, though New York's, as I tried to hint at, maybe jokingly, New York's extreme land costs have distorted everything in New York so long, since everything really, at least this type of housing, was built for a fairly wealthy segment of the population. Even though we would call them middle class, they're really today's upper middle class. Obviously it's hard to make direct comparisons because people had more servants, even though they're on a lower economic rung. But the brownstones covered in this book in general were built for the upper middle class or above, and much of the city's streetscape was built for this, even if later they've been adapted to other uses and to other economic groups.
Right. Okay. This is actually another question from Hannah, and because actually we've got quite a few questions, I might have skipped it, but actually it's a lovely question. Do you have a favorite street in the city for looking at these lovely buildings?
Well, I like all music. This is I like all my children equally. I think that what I showed there in Charlton Street, there's still something about it's obvious. It's almost the obvious answer. There is still something about those very early houses where they survive in any number that transports you to this alien New York that didn't, that stopped existing not that long after that. It wasn't just that it was something that was demolished recently. I love those houses very much. I think that for actual for quantity and quality, Bedford-Stuyvesant is really unmatched, just because there's so many houses. There may be over 10,000 surviving row houses there or more. Not all in the historic districts, but that's just where you can sort of see this vision of the row house city at length. So I love that as well. But it's hard to pick a favorite of all these things. There was just too much of a wealth of things in the book to even select from to select all the images that we shot.
Question from Rochelle Bihar. Did townhouses ever integrate a carriage house on the basement level?
Effectively, no. Where there were purpose-built carriage houses, there were sometimes blocks away. This again, there's rare examples where the Strivers Row houses in Harlem, 138th, 139th, they actually have alleyways. But this goes back to New York's original sin of this grid plan, which is not just Manhattan now, it's the rest of the city. The city doesn't have service alleys. So to have effective carriage houses, you need a service alley, but houses we don't have alleys. So no, there's no place to put it. Now, there's a handful of houses in the villages that have horse walks, including one of the ones I showed, but in general, no. I think I've said this in another talk, but it's sort of, if you were designing the perfect city in New York, you would have so many of the things you would have all these things that would make New York look nothing like it does, including the things that we love. Like we would put in alleys so we wouldn't have trash in front of our buildings, but the city would be completely different.
Rena Corey wants to know, growing up in Brooklyn, we always referred to our stoops. I heard you referred to stoops in Manhattan. Did Manhattanites always use that term too? Was it just common throughout New York City?
Yeah, it's from the Dutch, pardon my Dutch, but it's stoop. I don't know how to pronounce it actually, STOEP. So it's adapted. This is actually, again, this is an audience that'll appreciate it. This was Andrew Dolkart. He thought that the Charles' original version, claiming that the houses had taken the stoops from the Dutch because they were Dutch, was wrong, or at least mythological. So I slightly tweaked that in this book, in the text for the careful readers, is that the earliest houses in New York actually a lot of them didn't have stoops, or they only had like a 2 or 3 step stoop, at least from the scant surviving engravings. The high stoop that we see, part of the mythology there was just of low-lying land in the Netherlands, so you need something tall. But really, the reason for the high stoop configuration is having that service entrance below. Again, because there are no alleys, there's no other way to get to a house except for through the front of it, because there's no other possible way. And so I know I'm vastly simplifying things here, but one of these problems in New York City architecture is that you have a box with one side, and so much of the non-spatial and planning things of design decisions are like how to dress that side of the box and get everyone into that box. I mean, everyone from that side into the box.
Right. Thank you. Jeremy Woodruff writes, now I think he's really asking how you determine what a row house is. In fact, if he asks, I believe there are houses in the far reaches of Brooklyn that I believe could be called row houses and were built up and possibly past World War II. They often have garages built in the basement floor. Did you consider even going further into the 20th century with your book?
Well, this is the challenge of figuring out where to stop. And this is actually the Jonathan Taylor there, who I worked on the book with, did research into later tapestry brick houses. What we sort of decided, and actually I'm going to jump backward just to show you the picture, is that cut the book off saying 1917. These are houses on Albemarle Terrace and Flatbush that are very explicitly, especially the ones with the pitch roof, sort of homages to the early houses. I think that even though there were many row houses built afterwards, maybe even more than were built before 1917, that the questioner is referring to, that they're arguably out of a different tradition. The row house tradition in New York, described in the book, is of these single family houses built for the relatively affluent in that building tradition. The later ones are another form of urban row housing, but I sort of almost consider them a different category, especially when you start getting these houses that have garages and other things. So, I mean, that's certainly another thing that someone could write about is the vast forms of other row housing sort of outside of this tradition that exist in New York City.
Katie Angdon writes, it's a great presentation. And she wonders, whose responsibility do you think it is today to preserve the buildings? The city, the architect, developers, tenants?
I mean, I think that this is the boundary of regulation and not, is that there are lots of row house historic districts. I think that most of the most important intact ones have been designated. There's obviously more could be designated. The law, of course, doesn't reach inside of homes and can't by nature the way it works. I think that part of putting this book out there and hopefully getting it on the audience is people seeing what's inside and not owners not choosing to destroy interiors. Obviously, these things have to be adapted and change in some way for them to be usable in the present. Again, to go back to the plan, if anyone on the presentation is lucky enough to live in a single family house, or anyone else has been in it, it is a lot of floors, a lot of different living spaces spread across a lot of vertical geography. Especially most families don't have this, don't have the servants doing things. At least most of them today. We don't call them servants. We don't have servants technically anymore, I guess. So I think it comes down to, it's just a combination, both the public trust of knowledge of what's actually protected by regulation, but knowledge and ownership. And I have to say, one of the things I wanted to do in the book, and is to also just for everyone, I feel that most of the people that live in row houses don't actually live in a single family house. Like people live in divided houses. So just be able to pick up the elements of the houses and know if you're living on the second floor versus parlor floor, what's left there, and just knowing that as well. I think just having the knowledge is an important part of the preservation process, period.
Polly Gurham wonders, do you have any information on the Sarah Delano Roosevelt house at 200 Madison Avenue? Do you have something in particular about that? Can the responder give me some more? Is it standing or not, or is it demolished? I assume it's. I don't know if Polly's going to be able to reply quickly enough. Perhaps we'll come back to that.
Yeah, I don't have anything off the top of my head, but I would need to look at the geography
Right.
of where it is, because the name's not ringing a bell. Because there is the wait, what was the name of the owner?
Sarah Delano Roosevelt.
I know there's the CVS Roosevelt mansion that doesn't exist anymore, but I don't know that one off the top of my head, which is the name without reference to the building itself.
Luz Friedman, I wonder, comments, you speak of economics and profit, but do not mention the impact of the explosive population growth of these decades. And he comments, there was no way to house all these people without changing the structure of the building.
Oh yeah, that's true. And if I left it out, it was sort of the things go hand in hand. Is that the pace of building never really keeps up with the demand, and the central irony of the row house in New York City is that it was recognized fairly early in the 19th century that this was a kind of a fundamentally ridiculous way for this much land of the city to be taken up for such inefficient means. So even by the mid 19th century, there were calls to replace row houses with apartment buildings, and to abandon this form and have denser forms of housing, which does happen at the early 20th century. But through the 19th century, with most of the population, at least in Manhattan, which was New York City at the time, is that you have this divide between the relative in the term low density row house districts at the center, and then the high density tenement districts on either side of the river. I mean, that's an incredibly simplified version of it, but yeah, the commenter is correct.
Right. We have quite a few questions still, so I'm just going to try and just pick out a few. Joss Levin writes, what are the specific motivation for half underground basements with high entry stairs, for cost versus space efficiency? Why not a grade entry with an extra story or a fully subterranean basement?
I think that the easier way to answer that is that let me think about that for a second. I think one, it's harder to dig that fully subterranean. There maybe wasn't that much of a point to doing that. I think it's just that this was also a building tradition that was efficient to do it this way and as simple as way as possible. And it's sort of a reason that the high stoop configuration lasts so long, even though other configurations are shown as somewhat more sensible. I don't have time, but in the book, there's an alternate floor plan, which is basically what the questioner is describing, that actually has a grade level entrance, a fully subterranean basement, and a central stair, which in some ways is actually a better configuration. And then the parlor actually ends up on a floor above the full width of the house. So I think a lot of these things get locked in as building traditions where there possibly could have been better solutions. That's the simplest way to answer it. I think that there's a lot more to unpack there.
Susan Hess wonders, why did brownstone become so common? Was it cheap? Was it to do with the quarries it came from?
So it was two things. It was both that it was available and malleable. So there was the brownstone quarries both in New Jersey and in Connecticut, but also that the pneumatic tools came into being. So before that, most, this is sort of a vast simplification, but not that much of one, is that up to 1840 or so, at least in New York, a lot of what you see as ornaments or decoration on houses was in some way truly handmade, even if it was designed from a pattern book. With both cast iron and with brownstone, with these machine tools, it's easier to do something more elaborate for less. And then this is sort of Charles' original phrasing of it, is that at least for some time, is that machine-made ornaments still carried the status connotations of hand built. So that's why you get all this incrustation. So part of the popularity of brownstone is that it's actually easy to do elaborate and ornate things relatively cheaply. And this is sort of at the same era of the explosion of vast fortunes in New York, where previously these sort of more restrained houses had been with merchants or gentry that in some ways had some idea of restraint being a part of sophistication. Brownstone sort of comes hand in hand with the popularity of what at the time, and even in retrospect, we might call, vulgar taste of wanting ostentatiousness and it being easy to produce, mass produce.
And really a connection that sort of follows up on that. Is brownstone ever used for new construction in our era? And that's from David Wilder.
I presumably it is. I mean, it is a type of sandstone. The quarry in Portland closed recently after being open in Middletown, or Portland, Connecticut, near Middletown. I don't know how often it is used. Obviously, one of the huge issues with brownstone has been durability, since if it's cut the wrong way, it decays. And I think that this is one of I hesitate to attune you to it if you don't already notice it. But even in a lot of historic districts, a lot of buildings fronted with brownstone have been resurfaced, but often gruesomely. So you're losing a lot of the detail. I'm sure you've seen the resurfacing crews that are fairly common on streets. Those, unfortunately, are often done with a monolithic application of a sandstone like slurry or stucco, but the stone behind it actually does have expansion joints. So that stuff doesn't last very long because you have a monolithic thing that has things contracting behind it and pops off. I'd have to, maybe if there's any architects in the could put in the Q&A knowing of a modern use of brownstone not on a brownstone. I don't know the answer. It's a good one.
Yeah. We'll just take maybe 3 more questions, and I want to apologize to the audience because I know we still have like many more questions. But if I think because time is getting on, if that's okay with you, Patrick, if you feel comfortable with that, we'll take.
We could go on a little more if it's popular. It's kind of would you want to have a few more, or do we want to?
Oh, well, it's entirely up to you. Okay, okay.
These are good meaty questions.
Okay. Well, then we'll take more than 3 questions then. Now, Rachel Ann Rudding wonders, could you speak more on other brownstone belts in the city? I believe you mentioned the term in reference to Park Slope.
So I think that the colloquial application of this is really everything from Brooklyn Heights, stretching there east. If you look at a map of Brooklyn, most of the row houses, intact row houses in this, the non-wood frame row houses really stretch in that geography from Brooklyn Heights south and then moving east again and then fanning out to Eastern Parkway and then obviously Fort Greene and Clinton Hill there. And then even going deeper to places like Bay Ridge, Prospect, Lefferts Gardens. So, I think it's really, if you look at the map, it's almost everything northwest of Prospect Park up until you get to some of the historically wood frame housing areas that Greenpoint and Williamsburg and Bushwick were traditionally.
Right. I'm going to combine these 2 questions. Do you know when indoor plumbing was introduced? And Elaine Swerdlow asked, in the original row houses, how many bedrooms were there and approximately how many people slept in a bedroom? So
on the plumbing, the Croton water is the 1840s, I believe 1842. So that's when the public water system in Manhattan was adopted, and pretty soon most new houses, again because they're constructed for the relatively wealthy, have bathrooms and plumbing fixtures. And this is actually before that. It was actually, visitors describe this as this defect of American houses that even though very wealthy in New York would have privies in the back. The bedrooms are really variants of the size of the houses. So those modest ones where you see a large bedroom on the second floor above the parlor at the front and back. If you've been in the merchant's house, that's familiar from there. And then the upper floors have the smaller number of bedrooms where the servants would sleep. But then the buildings get more floors, so you might have an extra floor of family bedrooms as well. I think the number of people per room is honestly just a variant of family size. So there is no hard and fast rule there. I think that is one of the interesting things to think about, though, is the relative difference in scale between a house like the one we saw on Charlton Street, which is still sizable, even by modern American house suburban house standards. It's certainly sizable by modern, by New York City living space standards, is that the total square footage is guessing is probably around 3,000 even to 3,500. Then you go to these gigantic houses on the Upper West Side, which are almost sort of impossible to imagine in a single family configuration. Hope I'm not insulting anyone watching that lives in one as a single family configuration, but they're almost 8,000 to 9,000 square feet spread over five stories. So it's really dependent on house size, I think.
Linda Tilio wonders, didn't the single entrance exit cause issues with egress in cases of fire?
Well, you can always get out the back as well. So there's not just one door. So there is the rear yard, and then both the entrances at the ground level. I don't think so. That as everyone who has lived in one of these divided knows, is that most houses have a fire escape across the back, which isn't original to them, so that you have a secondary means outside of the hallway from the upper floors.
What do you believe how the future of row houses stand? Will they follow traditional or drift into more modernistic styles?
Well, I think the questioner is asking about interior designs of historic ones, which I think honestly follow taste. I'm just trying to nudge taste back away from people tearing down walls, and I think that open floor plans are the the tyranny that we might have to blame Frank Lloyd Wright for starting. So to point people away from that, but I think that the row house does, outside of its historical form in New York, offer a lesson for urban design that's dense, as like I said, but not overwhelming. I think that you read so much about people wanting cities to become denser, but I think that a lot of the solutions that people propose for new construction, this is outside of the history of the houses, usually involve high rises or taller buildings. Row houses actually, especially when they're divided into multifamily, are built at a density that supports mass transit, but it's not a scale, it's a scale that people have grown, I think, to appreciate and love. It feels urban and dense, but is not suffocating in the way that later forms are. And we actually even see this in New York, is that I think that neighborhoods that have a blend of both higher density apartment buildings and row houses are appealing, because you have both scales, but where one takes over the other, again, not to be pejorative about any one neighborhood, but places like famously 2nd Avenue on the Upper East Side or parts of Long Island City today, when you don't have that anchor of scale at all of the smaller buildings, you really lose a lot of the streetscape and life. So I think that that's a broader design thing that architects and planners need to take up again, is that there is a urban form that is dense, but just not suffocatingly so, that these houses actually that they actually embody.
Jeff Jacobson wonders what you feel about architects who take the interiors of these townhouses and basically, demolish most of the original details. I mean, I think perhaps there's a clear answer. I'm sure you have a clear answer on that. I mean,
I think it's stupid. It's just that if it's stupid, but it does make sense. As I showed you, it is this shell with a cover. I just think it's unimaginative, and for the most part, especially like I said, when you're creating spaces that are antithetical to just having, just going into I'm trying to think of the most articulate the least offensive way to say it, especially if architects have been involved in this. One of the most common things that see a lot is people demolishing the wall between the parlor and the hallway to quote unquote open up the space, but then you often have this awkward modern staircase stuck in there. There's a lot of stuff that I could document to taste. Obviously, for people to inhabit these, they there's evolution, but I think that would like to keep people in mind that once it's gone, it's not going back, and that basic form itself has proved so adaptable that maybe the best thing is not to destroy it at once. Because again, these houses were built for relatively wealthy people as single family residents. They've survived for 2 centuries, often not in that form, often with few changes. So is there, one should touch lightly if something has been that adaptable. And that's actually, I don't have the exact quote, but Peter Blake, the critic Peter Blake, he has a great book called Form Follows Fiasco about modern architecture. He was a modern architect, but about defects. And he actually says that one of the ironies is that flexible modern buildings have proven to be inflexible, while inflexible historic buildings have proven to be flexible. And I think the Brownstone really epitomizes this too, is that it in a variety of forms. And what I haven't shown in this presentation is how adaptable it was in Midtown to even commercial uses, where you have on side streets that these parlor floors and ground floors become stores and stuff like that. So that was a sort of a filibuster of an answer, but.
Right. Well, a very a wonderful and extensive answer. Judith Densky wonders, are you doing any research on the rear houses behind some of the brownstones, some for the for the maids, the staff, and possibly for the horses?
Well, there's not that. I mean, that's relatively rare again, and where there were service buildings or anything, most don't survive. So, I think that the greater historical lens there too is that backyards are now nice, but for forever were service areas where these where other structures were erected, but those for the most part don't survive. I know there are some mid-block buildings, but it's it's not extremely common. Remember that the servants were living in the houses, and that's actually a complaint of owners at the time, is that that there's just Irish servants like endlessly going up and down staircases, and that's all that the house really is.
Paul Napfrestek comments, following up, he's an architect and he's aware of no application to brownstones to new buildings, and he feels like you've already cited the reason. It's not really a very good stone to build with in terms of durability, and the quarries are mostly closed. But this is then following up on this is a very elementary question, and I think we'll just take 2 more questions after this. A very elementary question, excuse me. What was the brownstone and where did the bricks come in?
So, well, I think this gets back to a naming question that we sort of glossed over here, is that all brownstone was so popular a building material that it transposed into the name for the house itself. All brownstones are row houses. All row houses technically aren't brownstones because they can be faced in brick, terracotta, any other material. However, that's really, in New York colloquial speak, a row house is a brownstone. They're the same thing.
Richard Carlson wonders, there are many limestone row houses in Brooklyn and neighborhoods like Sunset Park and Borough Park. Are those included within your study, and are they more modest structures?
In general, in Brooklyn, they are more modest, and they are in there. I didn't have space to put anything from Sunset Park and Bay Ridge. The photograph I had at the beginning of the presentation of Maple Street and Prospect Lefferts, those are fairly similar to the houses you're discussing, and those are definitely part of this tradition. I think that one of the things that's fascinating about Brooklyn is that because land prices are lower, houses continue to get built, but most houses built after 1895 and 1900, maybe a little later actually, they are actually 2-family houses because they're not designed to have servants, first of all, and the stoops often are a little higher, so that they're actually designed to have an apartment in the on the garden floor already. So I believe I don't have that deep of knowledge of some of the blocks in Sunset Park and Bay Ridge, but that may be the case there, because it's certainly the case in deeper into Crown Heights and in Prospect, the non-single family portions of outside of the Prospect Lefferts Historic District, that what appear to be row houses, single family row houses, were built as two family. I think that those are part of the tradition because they're sort of mimicking the high stoop original house in a way that, you know, still made some sort of economic sense, both for the people who built them and for the people who bought or rented them.
Laura Meehan Agassian wonders, there are landmark houses in Chelsea, for example, on West 22nd Street, and she's curious about several blocks from West 43rd to 46th Street on 9th to 11th Avenue. Do you know if they're landmarked?
I don't believe those are landmarked. I think this is one of the, you know, the big philosophical things up for debate with designation in the LPC, is that in there's an essay at the beginning of the book by Fran Leeden, who's one of the co-authors of the AIA guide, and he said, you know, that used to be that these districts were dragnets pulling in a lot of things like Brooklyn Heights. There's been a trend toward micro districts, which of several houses. So some of those might be appropriate for those. Philosophically, it's you know, it's a funny thing to landmark those things. I'm with it, but at the same time, it's that sometimes they actually are amazing because of the contrast they provide. You know, New York is a city where variations in scale, you accept them as normal when you sit back and are surprised just by how ridiculous it would be in other places, where a three-story row house sits next to a 20-story building and you don't think about it at all. So I think that I some of these smaller rows, the landmarking is probably warranted if they're intact, but it is, you know, it's a complicated question.
Right, and I think this will be our final question for the night. How and what can architects take from this design and make it more flexible? What elements can still be applied to modern design?
I think that there's two answers to that. One is simply that you can get away with a lot of use on a relatively narrow building lot. I think that Americans are used to thinking horizontally, even in New York, buying the apartment next to you to expand into it. There's a lot that can be done in fairly narrow confines. It doesn't make a perfect house, but there's something workable there. I think the other thing of it too is to go back to the point I've been hammering over, of just thinking about these sort of relatively generic templates that are useful over and over. There's this central irony here, is that many of these houses aren't special, not to denigrate them. I love them. The book is about them, but they're relatively mass produced. So I think to think about what goes into something that is relatively common and would be appreciated, you know, the same way for years to come, and to think about what is needed in building that way. I don't think there is an answer to that, but I think this is also one of the, this is sort of a summation point too. One of the central puzzles of preservation is that generic stuff from the past can seem more charming than special things from the present. And I think as a non-architect, how architects can think that way too might be helpful, to think, again, to go back to Ada Louise Huxtable, as the parts forming more than the whole in the end, and then having less meaning as individual things.
Patrick, that was absolutely tremendous. Your vast and incredible knowledge about brownstones and row houses, I think, it would be unrivaled. And we're just so delighted that you could participate this evening, and it was a wonderful celebration and a tribute to the iconic New York row house. I also want to mention this opportunity, and if, in fact, my colleague is going to follow up on this. This incredible book can be purchased through Rizzoli Bookstore, and we'll link up very shortly to remind you how that book can be purchased. It will also make a wonderful gift for any New Yorker. I would also like to thank Lisa Easton of Easton Architects, who's created this 220 landmark lecture series, for her wonderful choice of speakers. All our current lectures had to be postponed from the spring, and I'm so delighted that we were able to reschedule such gifted speakers. So we'd like to express our appreciation to Lisa and to the New York Landmarks Conservancy, and I'm very pleased to say that Lisa will be curating the 2020 lectures. I'm now going to pass over to Victoria Dengel, our Executive Director, who would also like to say a few words.
Yes, Patrick, I can't wait to stroll the streets of Manhattan. This native New York can't wait to stroll the streets of Manhattan with more information of what I'll find in these brownstones, because I always peer up and wonder. Everybody looks at a brownstone and takes your little peek inside, so thank you. But I want to also say, well, besides this magnificent book, that I can't imagine, you've made Charles Lockwood smile down upon you, because I look at a book like this, that he started this when he 24 years old, and I read that you met him while you were a student, and to think that you carry on his legacy, this wonderful, wonderful book that really is a treasure. And I know I'll be purchasing a copy. I know we'll be seeing it at the General Society Library. We'll proudly display this. But thank you for this beautiful, beautiful tribute. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you for being a part of our lecture series. And I know that some of our lecture goers, we have a lot of faithful lecture goers, and we very much appreciate their support. So we want to thank everyone who joined the lecture tonight with Patrick. And Patrick, thank you for your generosity in answering all of those questions. But we have not in the past few times done our presentation. We will be presenting you when you arrive with a certificate, a frame certificate marking this evening, but also, and I know our lecture goers are missing this part of the evening, and we of course will give you your lifetime library membership. So we do hope you'll be coming here more, or visiting the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen. So thank you, Patrick.
Thank you. I look forward to normal reality resuming at some point, whenever
Yes,
that is.
absolutely, absolutely.
Totally. And so I want just to follow up on Victoria. Thank you again. Thank you to our audience tonight for their support. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all the questions, but it was an extremely popular topic, and I feel like we had like a world expert on brownstones and row houses. So Patrick, thank you so much. I'm just going to conclude by mentioning that two of our upcoming lectures will be 111 museums in New York that you must not miss. That will be next Tuesday, October 27th. And on December 10th, we have a completely different topic, steam heat sustainability, with Dan Holland, who's the International Authority in Steam Heating. That again, Tuesday, November 10th at 6 p.m. Thank you all for attending. Again, great thanks to Patrick and to Lisa this evening. We look forward to seeing you again in the future, and we look forward to the day we'll be able to see you all in person. Thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.